I never believed in Bigfoot, not even a little bit. I thought the whole thing was nonsense, a combination of misidentified bears, hoaxes, and people who desperately wanted to believe there was still mystery left in the world. I was a skeptic, a rationalist, someone who trusted data and evidence over folklore and blurry photographs. That's probably why what happened to me is so ironic, so completely unexpected. My name is Dr. Michael Chen, and I'm a wildlife biologist specializing in large predator behavior. For the past 12 years, I've been living in a remote research station in the North Cascades of Washington state, studying wolf pack dynamics and their impact on the local ecosystem. The station is about as isolated as you can get in the continental United States, 40 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a rough logging road that becomes impassable in winter, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of acres of pristine wilderness. It's exactly the kind of place where you'd expect to be alone, where human contact is rare and wildlife encounters are common. I moved here in 2012, right after my divorce, looking for a fresh start and a project that would consume all my attention so I wouldn't have to think about the life I'd left behind. The research station had been abandoned for almost a decade before I took it over, a cluster of 3 small buildings, a main cabin with living quarters and a lab, a storage shed and a generator house, all of it weathered and in need of repair, but structurally sound. I spent my first 6 months just making the place livable again, fixing the roof, updating the solar panels, establishing reliable communication systems, and setting up my research equipment. The work was exactly what I needed, physical and demanding, leaving me too exhausted at the end of each day to dwell on my failed marriage or the career opportunities I'd turned down to come out here. By the spring of 2013, I'd established my wolf monitoring protocol, a network of trail cameras, audio recording devices, and tracking collars that allowed me to observe pack behavior without constant direct contact. I'd hike out every few days to check equipment, download data, and document any changes in the pack's territory or composition. It was solitary work, sometimes going weeks without seeing another human being, but I found it peaceful in a way that my previous life, full of university politics and relationship drama, had never been. I was content, or at least I thought I was, living alone in the wilderness with my research and my routines. That all changed in July 2013, 13 months after I'd moved to the station. I'd been out checking cameras in a section of forest about 2 miles north of my cabin, an area where the wolf pack had been particularly active. I was downloading data from one of my cameras when I noticed something odd. The camera had been moved, not knocked over by an animal or blown by wind, but deliberately repositioned, angled differently than I'd set it. I checked the footage, expecting to see a bear or maybe a curious elk that had bumped into the mounting post. What I saw instead made absolutely no sense. The footage showed a figure approaching the camera at night, illuminated by the camera's infrared flash. The figure was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair, moving on 2 legs with a gait that was almost human, but not quite. It approached the camera, examined it closely, seemed to understand what it was, and then carefully, deliberately adjusted the angle so it was pointing away from a game trail and toward a small clearing. Then the figure moved into that clearing and stood there for almost 30 seconds, looking directly at the camera before walking away into the darkness. I watched that footage probably 50 times, sitting there in the forest with my laptop, trying to find any explanation that made sense. A person in a costume, but who would be out here, 40 miles from civilization, in the middle of the night, just to mess with a research camera? And the movement, the way the figure walked, the proportions of the body, none of it looked like a person in a suit. A bear standing upright, but bears don't walk on 2 legs for extended periods, and they certainly don't carefully adjust camera angles. I was looking at something that shouldn't exist, something that every scientific instinct I had told me was impossible. But the evidence was right there, recorded in high-definition infrared, undeniable and inexplicable. I packed up my equipment and hiked back to the station in a daze, my mind racing through possibilities and explanations, none of them satisfactory. I spent that evening reviewing the footage again and again, analyzing every frame, looking for any sign of fakery or misidentification. But the more I looked, the more convinced I became that what I'd captured was real. This was a living creature, something unknown to science, something that had deliberately interacted with my equipment. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed. I checked all my cameras obsessively, looking for more footage, more evidence. I found it. The creature appeared on multiple cameras, always at night, always alone, and always seeming to be aware of the cameras and curious about them. In one clip, it examined a camera for almost 5 minutes, turning it over in its hands, looking at it from different angles, before carefully putting it back exactly where it had been. In another, it appeared to be listening to one of my audio recording devices, its head tilted, clearly hearing the faint electronic hum that the equipment made. This wasn't just an animal wandering through my research area. This was an intelligent being, curious about my work, interested in the technology I was using, and deliberately making itself visible to my cameras. It was trying to communicate, or at least trying to establish some kind of contact. I should have reported it immediately. As a scientist, I had an obligation to document and report any significant wildlife findings, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the memory of all the Bigfoot hoaxes and the ridicule that serious researchers faced when they claimed to have evidence. Maybe it was a protective instinct, a sense that if I reported this, the creature would be hunted, captured, turned into a spectacle. Or maybe, and I think this is closest to the truth, I wanted to keep this discovery for myself, wanted to be the one to make contact, to understand what this being was before the world descended on this place and destroyed whatever fragile connection was forming. So I kept quiet, and I started trying to communicate back. I began leaving things near the cameras, simple objects that might interest an intelligent being. A mirror to see if it recognized its own reflection. A ball to see if it understood the concept of play. Books with pictures to gauge its reaction to human artifacts. And food, not as bait, but as an offering, a gesture of goodwill. The creature responded. It would examine everything I left, sometimes taking items, sometimes leaving them, but clearly having interacted with them. The mirror fascinated it. I have footage of it looking at its reflection for almost 20 minutes, touching its face, moving back and forth, clearly understanding that it was seeing itself. The ball it ignored completely, but the books it studied carefully, turning pages with surprising gentleness given the size of its hands. And the food it accepted, always taking it away from the camera's view, never eating in front of the equipment. We were communicating in a rudimentary way, across a divide that shouldn't have been crossable. I was a human scientist, and it was a creature that wasn't supposed to exist, and yet we were finding ways to acknowledge each other, to interact, to build something that might eventually become understanding. This went on for months. Through the fall and into the winter of 2013, I continued my official wolf research while secretly conducting this other study, this impossible project of trying to communicate with a Sasquatch. I documented everything meticulously, kept detailed notes, saved every piece of footage, but I told no one. The isolation that had once been peaceful now felt necessary, protective. I was guarding a secret that felt more important than anything I'd ever worked on. In December 2013, 6 months after I'd first captured the creature on camera, something changed. I was at the station one evening working on data analysis when I heard a sound outside that made me freeze. It was knocking, 3 deliberate knocks on the side of my cabin, too loud and too deep to be human. I sat there, my heart pounding, trying to decide what to do. The knocking came again, the same pattern, 3 measured strikes. It was clearly intentional, clearly a signal. The creature wasn't just interacting with my cameras anymore, it had come to my home. I stood up slowly and moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see outside. There, standing maybe 20 feet from my cabin, illuminated by the exterior light I kept on at night, was the creature I'd been studying for 6 months. But seeing it in person, not through a camera screen, was completely different. It was massive, probably 8 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed impossibly broad, covered in dark brown hair that looked thick and well-groomed. And its face, God, its face was so much more expressive than I'd realized from the footage. It was looking directly at the window where I stood, and even from that distance, I could see intelligence in its eyes, awareness, and something that looked like nervousness or uncertainty. It had taken a risk coming here, and it knew it. We looked at each other for a long moment, and then, slowly, I made a decision that would define the next 12 years of my life. I opened the door and stepped outside, my hands visible and empty, my posture as non-threatening as I could make it. The creature tensed, ready to run, but it didn't move. I took a few steps forward, then stopped, giving it space, giving it control over the distance between us. And then I did something that felt absurd, but also completely right. I spoke to it. "Hello," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "I'm Michael. I'm the one who's been leaving things for you. I don't want to hurt you, I just want to understand." The creature tilted its head, clearly listening, clearly processing. And then it did something that changed everything. It raised one massive hand and waved. A simple, deliberate gesture that was unmistakably a greeting, unmistakably human in its intent. It understood me. Not just the tone of my voice or my body language, but the actual meaning of what I'd said. This wasn't just an intelligent animal. This was a being capable of understanding human language, capable of responding with gestures that bridged our species. I waved back, and I saw something in the creature's expression that might have been relief or satisfaction. We stood there in the cold December night, a human and a Sasquatch, 20 feet apart, acknowledging each other's existence in a way that felt profound and historic and terrifying. That was the beginning. That was the night I stopped being just a wildlife biologist and became something else, a bridge between species, a translator of intentions, a student of a being that would teach me more about humanity than any human ever had. After that first direct encounter, everything changed. The creature, which I started calling Walker because of the distinctive way it moved through the forest, began visiting the research station regularly. Not every night, but several times a week, always after dark, always approaching with those 3 deliberate knocks that became our signal. I established a routine. When I heard the knocks, I'd step outside with a lantern and we'd spend time together in the clearing near my cabin. At first, we just looked at each other, maintaining that 20-foot distance, both of us trying to figure out what this relationship was and what it could become. But gradually, over weeks and months, we began to communicate more effectively. I started bringing a whiteboard outside, drawing simple pictures and pointing at objects, trying to establish a shared vocabulary. Walker watched with intense focus, and I could see it making connections, understanding that the symbols I drew represented real things. When I drew a tree and pointed at the forest, Walker nodded. When I drew a fish and pointed toward the stream, Walker made a sound that seemed like agreement. We were building a language together, something between human communication and whatever system Walker's species used. I learned that Walker could understand spoken English far better than I'd initially realized. It couldn't speak, its vocal anatomy was different from humans, but it could comprehend complex sentences, follow multi-step instructions, and respond with gestures and vocalizations that I gradually learned to interpret. Walker had a whole range of sounds: low rumbles that meant contentment, sharp barks that indicated alarm, a kind of humming that seemed to be thinking or processing, and a soft hooting that I came to understand meant curiosity or questioning. By the spring of 2014, almost a year after I'd first captured Walker on camera, we'd developed enough mutual understanding that I could ask questions and receive meaningful answers. I learned that Walker was male, probably in his 30s, based on physical maturity indicators. I learned that he lived alone, had been alone for many years, and that loneliness was something he felt deeply. I learned that he'd been watching me since I first arrived at the research station, had been curious about the human who came to live in the forest, who seemed to respect the wilderness rather than trying to dominate it. And I learned something that broke my heart. Walker's family had been killed by hunters about 15 years earlier, when he was young. He'd watched his mother, father, and younger sibling shot and killed by men who'd been tracking them, men who'd wanted proof that Sasquatch existed. Walker had escaped, had been living alone ever since, avoiding all human contact until he'd encountered me. He'd taken a tremendous risk approaching me, trusting me, and I felt the weight of that trust every single day. I asked him once, using my whiteboard and gestures, why he'd decided to make contact with me specifically, what made him think I was different from the humans who'd killed his family. Walker's response, communicated through a series of gestures and sounds that took me almost an hour to fully understand, was profound. He said, or at least this is my interpretation of what he communicated, that he'd watched me for months before making contact. He'd seen how I worked with the wolves, how I observed without interfering, how I treated the forest with respect. He'd seen me rescue an injured deer from a trap, spending hours freeing it and treating its wounds, even though it wasn't part of my research. He'd seen me sit quietly in the forest, not doing anything, just being present, appreciating the beauty around me. And he'd decided that I was someone who might see him as a being rather than a specimen, someone who might offer companionship rather than exploitation. That conversation, if you can call it that, changed how I saw my role. I wasn't just a scientist studying an unknown species. I was a friend, maybe the only friend Walker had in the world, and that came with responsibilities that went beyond research. I stopped thinking about publishing papers or gaining recognition for this discovery. I started thinking about what Walker needed, what would make his life better, how I could be a good neighbor to someone who'd been alone for far too long. We fell into a comfortable pattern over the following years. Walker would visit several times a week, and we'd spend hours together. Sometimes I'd teach him things, showing him books and photographs, explaining human technology and culture. Walker was endlessly curious about human life, wanted to understand why we built things, why we lived in groups, why we seemed so disconnected from the natural world that sustained us. Other times, Walker would teach me. He showed me things about the forest that I'd never noticed despite years of training. He taught me to read animal signs I'd been missing, to understand the complex relationships between species, to see the forest as an interconnected whole rather than a collection of individual elements. He showed me plants that had medicinal properties, demonstrated tracking techniques that were far superior to anything I'd learned in graduate school, and revealed patterns in animal behavior that changed how I understood predator-prey dynamics. But more than the practical knowledge, Walker taught me about perspective, about what it meant to be an outsider, about loneliness and connection, and the fundamental need for understanding that transcends species. We'd sit together in the clearing, sometimes for hours without any attempt at communication, just being present with each other, and I'd feel a sense of peace and belonging that I hadn't felt in years. Walker became not just a research subject or even a friend, but something closer to family, someone whose well-being mattered to me as much as my own. In 2016, 4 years into our relationship, something significant happened. I'd been dealing with a personal crisis. My father had died suddenly, and I was struggling with grief and regret about our complicated relationship. I hadn't told Walker about it, hadn't tried to explain human family dynamics or death rituals, but somehow he knew something was wrong. He showed up at the station every single night for 2 weeks, just sitting with me, not trying to communicate or interact, just being present. One night, when I was particularly low, sitting outside crying, Walker did something he'd never done before. He approached closer than he ever had, closing that 20-foot distance we'd always maintained, and he sat down right next to me. Then, carefully, gently, he put one massive arm around my shoulders and just held me while I cried. It was the first time we'd had direct physical contact, and it was one of the most compassionate gestures I'd ever experienced. Walker didn't understand the specifics of my grief, didn't know about human fathers or complicated family relationships, but he understood loss and loneliness and the need for comfort. He understood that sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is just be there, just offer presence and warmth without trying to fix anything. That night changed our relationship fundamentally. We weren't just neighbors or friends anymore. We were family, chosen family, two beings from different species who'd found in each other something essential that had been missing from both our lives. Over the next several years, Walker and I developed what I can only describe as a deep friendship built on mutual respect and genuine affection. I learned more about his species, his culture, the way his people had lived before humans had pushed them to the edge of extinction. He told me about their philosophy, if that's the right word for it, a worldview that saw humans as younger siblings, beings with great potential, but also great capacity for destruction. His people had watched humans for thousands of years, had seen us grow from small tribes living in harmony with nature to massive civilizations that consumed everything in their path. They'd made a collective decision generations ago to hide, to remove themselves from human awareness, because they'd seen what happened to species that humans noticed: extinction, captivity, or exploitation. Those were the only outcomes. Walker's family had been part of one of the last remaining groups, maybe 20 individuals, living in the deepest parts of the Cascades, and the hunters who'd killed them had reduced that number even further. Walker didn't know if there were any others left. He'd searched for years after his family died, calling out in the ways his people used to communicate across distances, listening for responses that never came. He might be the last one, the final representative of a species that had once thrived across the continent. The weight of that possibility, the loneliness of potentially being the last of your kind, was something Walker carried every day. And yet, despite everything humans had taken from him, despite the fact that my species had destroyed his, Walker had chosen to reach out to me, to trust me, to build a friendship. That choice, that act of forgiveness and hope, taught me more about grace and humanity than anything I'd learned in my entire life. By 2020, 8 years into our friendship, I'd accumulated an enormous amount of documentation. Thousands of hours of footage, detailed journals, photographs, recordings of Walker's vocalizations, drawings he'd made, artifacts he'd shared with me. I had enough evidence to prove beyond any doubt that Sasquatch existed, that they were intelligent and capable of complex communication, that they deserved recognition and protection. But I'd also made a promise to Walker, spoken aloud one night when he'd asked me, through our shared communication system, what I planned to do with all the information I'd gathered. I'd promised him that I would never reveal his existence without his permission, that his safety and autonomy mattered more than scientific recognition or public knowledge. It was a promise that cost me professionally. I continued publishing papers about wolf behavior, maintained my legitimate research, but I knew I was sitting on the discovery of the century and couldn't share it. Colleagues wondered why I stayed at this isolated station year after year, why I turned down prestigious positions at universities, why I seemed content with modest research grants and minimal recognition. I couldn't tell them that I stayed because I had a friend who needed me, because I'd found something more valuable than career advancement, because some relationships matter more than professional success. The COVID pandemic in 2020 and 2021 actually made things easier in some ways. The isolation that had always defined my life became normal for everyone else, and the reduced human activity in the forests meant Walker could move around more freely, could visit during daylight hours occasionally, could relax some of the extreme caution that had governed his life. We spent more time together during those years than ever before, and our communication became increasingly sophisticated. Walker learned to read basic English, could understand written words and simple sentences. I learned more of his gestural language, the complex system of signs and sounds that his people had used. We could have conversations now, real exchanges of ideas about philosophy, about nature, about what it meant to be conscious and alive in a world that often seemed hostile to both of us. One conversation in particular, in the fall of 2021, changed how I understood everything. We were sitting in our usual spot, and I asked Walker something I'd been wondering about for years. I asked him what he thought about humanity, about my species, given everything we'd done to his people and to the world. Walker's response took almost an hour to fully communicate, but the essence of it was this. He said that humans were the most paradoxical species he'd ever observed. We were capable of extraordinary cruelty, yes. We'd driven his people to extinction. We'd destroyed vast ecosystems. We'd created weapons that could end all life on Earth. But we were also capable of extraordinary compassion. We created art and music that moved the soul. We built hospitals to heal strangers. We developed philosophies about justice and equality, even when we failed to live up to them. We were capable of changing, of learning, of becoming better than we'd been. Walker said that his people had debated for generations whether humans were worth saving, whether we'd ultimately destroy ourselves and everything else, or whether we'd eventually mature into the potential we carried. His family had believed in human potential, had believed that despite everything, humans were worth hoping for. That's why they'd stayed in areas near human civilization rather than retreating to the deepest wilderness. They'd wanted to witness what we'd become, wanted to believe that we'd eventually choose wisdom over destruction. And Walker said that knowing me, being my friend, had convinced him that his family had been right, that if one human could learn to see beyond his own species, could value a friendship with someone completely different, could choose relationship over exploitation, then maybe humanity as a whole could learn those lessons too. Maybe we weren't doomed. Maybe we were just young, still learning, still capable of growth. I sat there with tears streaming down my face, humbled by the faith this being had in my species, despite everything we'd done to his. Walker had every reason to hate humans, to want revenge, to see us as nothing but destroyers. Instead, he chose to see our potential, to believe in our capacity for change, to offer friendship as an act of hope. That conversation became the foundation for a decision I made in early 2024, 12 years after I'd first encountered Walker. I asked him if he'd be willing to let me share his story with the world, not to expose him or put him at risk, but to offer humanity a mirror, a chance to see ourselves through the eyes of someone we'd nearly destroyed. I told him I believed that people needed to know what we'd lost, what we were still losing, and what we might still save if we chose differently. Walker thought about it for weeks, and I could see him wrestling with fear and hope, with the trauma of his past and the possibility of a different future. Finally, he agreed, but with conditions. He wanted to remain anonymous, wanted his location protected, wanted assurances that the focus would be on the message rather than on him as a specimen or curiosity. He wanted his story to be a call for change, not a spectacle. I spent months preparing, working with lawyers and ethicists and conservation organizations to figure out how to reveal Walker's existence in a way that would protect him while still delivering the message he wanted to share. We decided on a carefully controlled release, a documentary that would show footage of Walker, share our story, but never reveal specific locations or details that could lead people to him. The documentary was released in June 2024, and the response was everything we'd hoped for and everything we'd feared. Some people were moved, were inspired to think differently about conservation and about our relationship with the natural world. Others were skeptical, called it an elaborate hoax, demanded more proof, wanted Walker captured and studied. And some, the ones we'd feared most, wanted to hunt him, to prove they could find and kill the last Sasquatch, to mount his head on a wall as the ultimate trophy. Walker had to go deeper into hiding after the release, had to stop visiting the station for months while the attention was at its peak. It was the longest we'd gone, without contact in 12 years, and I felt his absence like a physical ache. But gradually, as the initial frenzy died down, as public attention moved on to other things, Walker began visiting again. Cautiously at first, then with increasing frequency, as he realized that the increased security measures we'd put in place were working, that his location remained secret. Now, in late 2024, 12 years after our friendship began, Walker and I continue our regular visits. The world knows he exists, knows that Sasquatch are real and intelligent and deserving of protection, but Walker himself remains safe, hidden, protected by a network of people who understand that some beings deserve privacy and autonomy more than they deserve to be studied. And the message Walker wanted to share, the reason he agreed to reveal himself, is reaching people. Conservation efforts in the Pacific Northwest have intensified, with new protections for old-growth forests and remote wilderness areas. There's a growing movement to recognize non-human intelligence and grant legal protections to species that demonstrate self-awareness and complex cognition. And perhaps most importantly, people are starting to ask different questions about our relationship with the natural world, about what we owe to the species we share this planet with, about whether dominion means destruction or stewardship. Walker once told me, through our complex system of gestures and sounds and shared understanding, that the difference between his people and mine wasn't intelligence or emotion or even consciousness. Those things, he said, we shared. The difference was in how we saw our place in the world. His people saw themselves as part of the forest, one thread in an interconnected web where every species had value and purpose. Humans, he observed, saw themselves as separate from nature, as masters of it rather than participants in it. And that separation, that sense of being above, rather than within the natural world, was the source of most human problems. He said it with compassion, not judgment, the way you might point out that a child hasn't yet learned an important lesson. I've spent the last 12 years learning that lesson from Walker, and it's changed everything about how I understand my own humanity. Before I met Walker, I thought being human meant being rational, scientific, capable of abstract thought and technological innovation. Those things mattered, but they weren't what defined us. What defined us, what made us truly human, was our capacity for relationship, for empathy that crossed boundaries, for choosing connection over isolation. Walker taught me that humanity isn't about what makes us different from other species. It's about recognizing what we share with them, the need for companionship, the capacity for joy and grief, the desire to be seen and understood, the fear of being alone. These aren't human traits. They're traits of consciousness itself, and they exist in many forms across many species. When we recognize that, when we see other beings as fellow travelers rather than resources or obstacles, we become more human, not less. One of the most profound things Walker shared with me was his people's concept of what they called the long view. His species lived longer than humans, often reaching 80 or 90 years, and they thought in terms of generations rather than individual lifetimes. They made decisions based on how those decisions would affect their great-grandchildren, not just their immediate circumstances. They saw themselves as temporary caretakers of the forest, responsible for leaving it healthier than they'd found it. Humans, Walker observed, think in much shorter time frames. We make decisions based on immediate benefit, on what serves us right now, and we're often surprised when those decisions have terrible long-term consequences. We cut down forests for short-term profit and wonder why the climate is changing. We pollute rivers for industrial convenience and wonder why ecosystems are collapsing. We prioritize individual gain over collective well-being and wonder why our societies are fragmenting. It's not that we're stupid or evil, Walker said. We're just thinking on the wrong timescale. We're making decisions as if we're the only generation that matters, as if the world ends with us. But it doesn't. Our choices echo forward, affecting beings we'll never meet, shaping a future we'll never see. And until we learn to think in terms of that longer view, we'll keep making the same mistakes. I asked Walker once if he thought humanity could change, if we could learn to think differently before we destroyed ourselves and everything else. He said yes, but only if we learned to listen, not just to other humans, but to the world around us, to the forests and rivers and animals that were trying to tell us what we needed to know, to the indigenous peoples who'd maintained sustainable relationships with the land for thousands of years, to the scientists who were documenting the damage we were doing, and to beings like him, voices from species we'd dismissed or destroyed, offering perspectives we desperately needed. The tragedy, Walker said, was that humans had the capacity for this kind of listening, this kind of learning. We just rarely chose to use it. We were so busy talking, so convinced of our own importance and rightness that we couldn't hear the wisdom being offered to us from every direction. Living with Walker as my neighbor for 12 years has taught me to listen in ways I never did before, to pay attention to the subtle signs in the forest that indicate health or distress, to notice patterns in animal behavior that reveal larger truths about ecosystem dynamics, to hear the messages in silence, in the spaces between words, in the gestures and expressions that communicate more than language ever could, and most importantly, to listen to my own heart, to the part of me that knows we're all connected, that understands my well-being is tied to the well-being of the forest and the creatures in it, including Walker. That connection, that sense of being part of something larger than myself, has given my life a meaning and purpose that my previous career never did. I'm not just a scientist anymore. I'm a bridge, a translator, someone who's been given the extraordinary privilege of friendship with a being from another species and the responsibility to share what I've learned. Walker's message to humanity, the reason he agreed to let me tell his story, is simple but profound. He wants us to know that we're not alone in our consciousness, our capacity for thought and feeling and connection. We share this world with other intelligent beings, some of them so different from us that we've failed to recognize their intelligence. And we have a choice about how we relate to them. We can continue on our current path, treating other species as resources or obstacles, driving them to extinction, destroying the ecosystems we all depend on, or we can choose differently. We can recognize that intelligence and consciousness come in many forms, that all of them have value, that our survival and flourishing depend on the survival and flourishing of the whole web of life. Walker believes we're capable of making that choice, capable of becoming the species we have the potential to be. He's seen the worst of humanity, has lost everything to human violence and greed, and yet he still has hope for us. That hope, that faith in our potential despite all evidence to the contrary, is perhaps the most human thing about him. It's certainly the thing that moves me most deeply. I'm 54 years old now, and I've spent the last 12 years living next to a Sasquatch, learning from him, being changed by him. When people ask me what it's been like, what I've learned, I tell them this: Walker taught me that being human isn't about being superior or separate. It's about being humble enough to learn from those who are different, brave enough to build bridges across impossible divides, and wise enough to recognize that we're all in this together. Every species, every being, every consciousness that shares this planet with us. We're all neighbors, whether we acknowledge it or not, and the quality of our lives, the future of our world, depends on how we choose to treat our neighbors. Walker chose to treat me with kindness, patience, and hope, even though my species had destroyed his. That choice, that act of grace, is what humanity looks like at its best. And if a Sasquatch can show that kind of humanity, then surely we humans can learn to do the same. My name is Dr. Michael Chen, and I've lived near Bigfoot for 12 years. What he's taught me about humanity, about connection, about hope and forgiveness and the possibility of change has moved me in ways I never expected. And I hope, by sharing his story, it moves you too. Because we need to be moved, we need to change, and we need to do it now, while there's still time, while there are still wild places and wild beings who can teach us what we've forgotten. Walker is still out there, still my neighbor, still my friend, still. And every time I see him, every time we sit together in the clearing and communicate across the impossible divide between our species, I'm reminded that the most important things in life aren't the things that make us different. They're the things we share. Consciousness, connection, the need to be seen and understood, the hope for a better future. These are the things that make us all, human and Sasquatch alike, part of the same family. And family takes care of each other. That's what Walker taught me. That's what I hope we can all learn before it's too late.